48 ships, 5 days, one narrow stretch of water. That's the number that should be making headlines around the world right now, and yet most people have no idea it's happening. Somewhere in the Sea of Azov, a fleet of aging oil tankers built to hide from satellites, sanctions, and scrutiny is being hunted down one by swarms of Ukrainian drones. And it is losing. Badly. In just 5 consecutive nights, nearly 50 vessels belonging to Russia's so-called shadow fleet have been struck, set ablaze, or disabled. This isn't a skirmish. This is the systematic dismantling of the machine that keeps Vladimir Putin's war economy afloat, and it's happening faster than almost anyone predicted. To understand why 48 tankers matter so much, you first need to understand what those tankers actually represent, because this isn't just a story about ships. It's a story about how Russia managed to keep its entire war effort financially alive for 4 years despite facing some of the harshest economic sanctions in modern history, and how that lifeline is now, quite literally, burning on the water. When Western sanctions hit Russia hard following the full-scale invasion in 2022, the Kremlin faced an existential financial problem. Oil and gas exports have historically made up somewhere around 60% of Russia's total exports, and roughly 40% of the state's entire revenue base. Cut off from Western shipping companies, insurers, and financial institutions that enforced the G7's price cap on Russian crude, Moscow needed an alternative, and it needed one fast. The answer it settled on was as clever as it was cynical. Buy up aging, near-retirement oil tankers from Western ship owners. Many of them, ironically, sold off for enormous profits by Greek shipping companies, reflag them under obscure registries like Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands, switch off their tracking transponders, and use them to move sanctioned oil around the world while hiding in plain sight. This became known as Russia's shadow fleet, and by nearly every measure it worked spectacularly well. Estimates suggest this fleet eventually grew to somewhere around 1,000 vessels, and in 2024 alone, it is believed to have generated more than $9 billion in additional revenue for the Kremlin by allowing Russian oil to be sold above the $60 per barrel cap that Western nations had tried to impose. For years, this fleet operated with something close to impunity. It carried an estimated 70% of Russia's total seaborne oil exports, and closer to 89% of its crude oil exports specifically. It became, in effect, one of the most important financial arteries feeding Russia's ability to keep fighting in Ukraine. And for a long time, it seemed almost untouchable, spread across oceans, disguised behind shell companies in Hong Kong and the UAE, protected by a legal gray zone that made prosecution and interdiction agonizingly slow. But something has changed dramatically in the last 2 weeks. And it's changed so quickly that even seasoned war analysts are struggling to keep their own reporting updated in real time. Ukraine has stopped treating this fleet as an abstract sanctions problem to be solved through diplomatic letters and slow-moving international pressure. It has started treating it as a military target. And the results, over just 5 days in July 2026, have been nothing short of staggering. Let's walk through exactly how this happened, night by night, because the escalation itself tells an incredible story. It began quietly, almost unnoticed, on the night of July 5th into July 6th, when Ukrainian forces struck 2 tankers, vessels identified as the Kapitan Barman and the Sanner III, in the waters feeding Russian-occupied Crimea. At the time, it looked like a routine, if notable, single strike. Nobody watching closely could have predicted what was about to unfold over the following 96 hours. The very next night, July 6th into July 7th, operators from a specialized Ukrainian unit known as Kairos, part of the 414th Separate Brigade nicknamed Birds of Magyar, launched a coordinated wave of long-range attack drones directly into a convoy of tankers moving through the Sea of Azov. 8 tankers were hit and set on fire in a single night, along with a dry cargo ship and a ferry. Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces commander, Major Robert Magyar Brovdy, described the results as industrial scale, posting footage of fires erupting across the water and declaring, in a now widely shared telegram post, that the fuel tanks aboard the targeted vessels were badly damaged and burning. He named the vessels specifically: Venera 3, Sonar 1, Sonar 17, Klimena, Teti, Alexei Savrasov, Penelopa, and Ivan Cheremisinov. Every single one confirmed to be under international sanctions, each with a dead weight of roughly 7,000 tons, about 140 meters long, built somewhere between 2006 and 2012. These weren't random targets. These were the exact class of aging, disposable vessels that make up the backbone of Russia's sanctions evasion machine. If that had been the end of it, it would already have counted as one of the most significant single strikes on Russia's shadow fleet of the entire war. But it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of an escalating pattern that would repeat and intensify for 5 straight nights. On the July 7th into July 8th, Ukrainian drones returned and struck 9 more vessels, including tankers named Efrosinya Fev, Maria, Sonar 4, and, remarkably, both Sonar 17 and Clemena for a second time in as many nights, suggesting these particular ships had either been patched up enough to sail again, or were simply too economically valuable for Russia to abandon, despite already sustaining battle damage. By this point, according to Brovdy's own running tally, Ukrainian forces had struck 21 vessels total over the preceding 72 hours. 19 Shadow Fleet tankers, 1 cargo ship, and 1 ferry. His message to followers carried an almost theatrical confidence that has become something of a signature for Ukraine's drone forces throughout this campaign. "Ready to see the next Shadow Showdown?" he asked, before revealing the night's results. Then came July 8th into July 9th, and the scale of the operation eclipsed everything that had come before it. 14 additional vessels were struck, 12 tankers, 1 cargo ship, and a tugboat. Among the ships identified was the Galyaskar Kamal, a sanctioned tanker sailing under a Panamanian flag, a detail that underscores just how deeply Ukrainian intelligence and targeting systems have penetrated the deliberately confusing flag of convenience system that Shadow Fleet operators rely on to obscure ownership and evade accountability. By the morning of July 9th, the cumulative total over 96 hours stood at 35 vessels, tankers, cargo ships, and specialized support ships, struck in the Sea of Azov. For context on just how extraordinary that number is, the Ukrainian Navy had previously managed to damage a total of 6 Russian tankers operating off Turkey's northern coast and in the Mediterranean over a full 3-week period in late 2025. What Ukraine achieved in the Sea of Azov in less than 4 days matched or exceeded that entire 3-week campaign nearly 6 times over. And then on July 9th into July 10th, the campaign reached its current peak. 13 more vessels were struck, 10 tankers, 1 dry cargo ship, 1 ferry, and 1 tugboat, all confirmed by Ukraine's unmanned systems forces as part of Russia's sanctioned Shadow Fleet. This final wave pushed the cumulative total over 120 hours, 5 full days, to 48 vessels struck. Ukraine's general staff, in a separate but overlapping statement, described the broader operation as one of its largest overnight strikes to date, reporting 18 vessels hit in that single night alone, 13 tankers, 3 cargo ships, 1 ferry, and 1 auxiliary vessel. 48 ships, 5 days. Let that number sit for a moment, because it represents something historians of this war will likely look back on as a genuine turning point in how naval and economic warfare have been fused together on the modern battlefield. Now here's where the story becomes even more interesting, because this wasn't simply a case of Ukraine getting lucky with a few isolated strikes. This was a deliberate, calculated shift in strategy. And understanding why Ukraine pivoted specifically to targeting tankers at sea requires understanding what happened in the months leading up to this campaign. For much of 2026, Ukraine had focused its efforts on strangling Crimea's land-based supply routes, striking railway bridges, hitting the Kerch Bridge's capacity for hazardous cargo, and turning the overland land bridge through occupied southern Ukraine into what analysts have bluntly described as a death trap for Russian supply trucks. That campaign worked. It worked so well, in fact, that it forced Russia into a corner, compelling Moscow to lean increasingly on an alternative it had previously used only as a backup: shipping fuel to Crimea by sea, across the Sea of Azov, using precisely the aging Shadow Fleet tankers that had spent years quietly moving sanctioned oil to buyers in Asia. In other words, Ukraine's land campaign didn't just disrupt supply lines, it actively pushed Russia's fuel logistics into the exact environment where Ukraine's naval drone capabilities happened to be strongest. The Institute for the Study of War, a widely respected Washington-based think tank that has closely tracked this conflict since its earliest days, assessed this shift explicitly, describing it as a new phase in Ukraine's broader campaign to isolate occupied Crimea, a phase defined by the recognition that months of pressure on road and rail routes had forced Russia's hand, and Ukraine had adapted its targeting priorities accordingly in near real time. This is, frankly, a remarkable piece of adaptive military strategy. It's the digital age equivalent of a chess player forcing an opponent into a losing position several moves in advance, not by attacking the final target directly, but by systematically eliminating every alternative option until only one path remains, and then attacking that path with overwhelming, coordinated force. And the tools Ukraine has developed to execute this final phase are themselves worth examining closely, because the technology involved here represents a genuine leap forward in how naval warfare is being conducted in the 21st century. Reports from Defense Express and other specialized military analysis outlets indicate that many of these tanker strikes are being carried out using FP-2 kamikaze attack drones. But it's not just the drones themselves that matter here, it's how they're being used tactically. According to detailed analysis of strike footage, Ukrainian drone operators have been specifically targeting the deckhouses of these tankers, the raised structure toward the rear of a vessel that houses the bridge, crew quarters, and command systems. This isn't an arbitrary targeting choice. By hitting the deckhouse directly, a single drone strike can simultaneously damage a ship's command and control capability, its engine room, and its cargo oil tanks all at once, maximizing the odds of completely disabling a vessel with a single successful hit, rather than merely causing superficial damage that a crew could quickly repair or work around. This is precision warfare being conducted against slow-moving, poorly defended commercial vessels that were never designed or armored to withstand this kind of targeted attack in the first place. And we don't have to rely solely on Ukrainian claims to verify that this is actually happening at scale. Independent open-source evidence has piled up alongside the official Ukrainian statements, providing exactly the kind of corroboration that separates a credible military claim from mere propaganda. NASA's Fire Information for Resource Management System, known by the acronym FIRMS, has repeatedly detected intense heat signatures and active fires in precisely the locations where Ukraine claims its strikes occurred, including one cluster of fires roughly 15 kilometers northeast of occupied Kerch, just 4 kilometers from Cape Crony, and remarkably close, only about 20 kilometers, from the Kerch Bridge itself. Separately, RFE-RL's investigative unit known as SCEMI published satellite imagery sourced from the commercial satellite company Planet Labs on July 9th and 10th, showing what appears to be a burning tanker, along with another apparently damaged vessel, near the Kerch Strait, visual, independently sourced confirmation that lines up precisely with the timeline of Ukraine's claimed strikes. Even more tellingly, open-source maritime analysts tracking commercial shipping data have reported that Russian tanker traffic through the Sea of Azov has declined sharply as this campaign has intensified, meaning that beyond the confirmed strikes themselves, shipping operators appear to be voluntarily pulling vessels out of the area entirely, presumably concluding that the financial risk of continuing to operate in these waters now outweighs whatever profit margin remains from evading Western sanctions. Perhaps most tellingly of all, Russia's own regional officials, as opposed to its Federal Ministry of Defense, which has largely avoided confirming these naval losses in any detail, have occasionally let the truth slip through in ways that corroborate Ukraine's account almost precisely. Yuri Slausar, the governor of Russia's Rostov region, confirmed via his own Telegram channel that Ukrainian drones had again attacked 2 tankers in Taganrog Bay, describing mechanical damage and fires aboard both vessels, though he noted there were no injuries, and that tanker crews had been safely evacuated before the fires could be fully brought under control. This marked, notably, the second time within a single week that Russian regional authorities had been forced to publicly acknowledge drone strikes on tankers in that specific bay. A small but significant crack in what has otherwise been a wall of official silence from Moscow's central command structures. A single die-cast aluminum piece collapses all of that into one component, poured once, inspected once, and bolted into the rest of the structure once. Here's the comparison that makes that collapse tangible. Going from dozens of welded steel pieces to a single cast aluminum piece is a bit like replacing a jigsaw puzzle with a single molded tray shaped exactly like the finished picture. There's nothing left to misalign, nothing left to weld imperfectly, and dramatically less that can go wrong on the assembly line itself. Think about what that does to the factory floor. Not just the finished car, fewer welding robots, fewer welding-related defects to catch and quality control, and a shorter, simpler assembly line overall, which is exactly the kind of manufacturing efficiency that lets a company the size of Sherry spread the enormous upfront cost of a 3,500-ton die-casting press across hundreds of thousands of vehicles instead of the tens of thousands a smaller luxury brand might sell in the same period. And here's the reality check that keeps this from being pure hype. Engineers who've studied Sherry's Hunyuan platform note the company paired the aluminum structure with an H-arm multi-link suspension design featuring hydraulic bushings, a setup usually associated with more expensive, more comfort-focused platforms, specifically because a lighter body needs a correspondingly well-tuned suspension to avoid feeling harsh or unsettled over rough pavement. Since a lighter structure has less inherent mass to absorb small impacts on its own, that detail matters, because it shows an engineering team thinking about the whole system rather than chasing one headline number in isolation. Here's the last comparison worth sitting with before we zoom out. The story of aluminum trickling down from ultra-premium vehicles into mainstream ones has happened before, most notably when Audi's aluminum-intensive A8 architecture from the late 1990s eventually influenced aluminum use across far cheaper Volkswagen Group products over the following 2 decades. The difference this time is that the trickle-down has been compressed from decades into a single product generation, arriving in an export market compact SUV within just a few years of the underlying gigacasting technique becoming commercially viable at all. Here's a final piece of the mechanism worth closing on, because it's the part that actually pays off years after the sale, rather than showing up on a spec sheet at launch. Steel bodies rust from the inside out, starting at seams, Weld points and panel gaps where moisture collects and paint coverage is hardest to guarantee, which is exactly why older vehicles in cold, salted road climates so often develop rust holes around wheel arches and rocker panels long before their mechanical components wear out. Aluminum doesn't oxidize the same corrosive way steel does, and a body with dramatically fewer weld seams has dramatically fewer places for that kind of decay to even begin. Think about what that means for a used car market a decade from now. A structure that resists the specific failure mode that usually determines when an affordable car's frame becomes unsafe to keep driving, arriving on a vehicle priced for buyers who typically keep cars far longer than luxury SUV owners do, and who rarely have the budget to walk away from a car the moment its frame starts showing its age, the way a wealthier buyer trading in every 3 years never has to think about. So let's pull this whole list back together because, seen from bottom to top, it stops looking like 5 disconnected features and starts looking like one coherent argument. At the bottom sits a design language deliberately borrowed from decades of premium, body-on-frame SUV styling, backed by a design team with actual joint venture experience, alongside the luxury brand whose look it's echoing. One step up sits a technology stack, the same processor family, the same tier of driver assistance software, the same convenience features that used to be exclusive to premium trims and premium price tags. Above that sits a powertrain and battery combination, competitive with EVs costing 2 to 3 times as much, wrapped in a 4-wheel drive system genuinely capable of light off-road use rather than just looking the part in a parking lot. Above that sits a price structure, so far below its closest styling rivals that even in its most expensive, most heavily taxed export markets, it still undercuts a G-Class by a wide margin. And at the very top sits the part that ties the entire argument together. A genuinely all-aluminum body structure, gigacast and honeycomb reinforced, crash-tested to a 5-star rating, delivering the weight savings and corrosion resistance that used to be one of the clearest signals separating a luxury vehicle from an ordinary one. Here's the metathesis, the pattern sitting underneath this entire story. This is the same shift budget smartphone makers caused to the flagship phone market a decade ago. Nobody believed a phone costing a quarter of an iPhone's price could ship with a genuinely good camera, a fast processor, and premium-feeling materials, right up until several Chinese phone brands did exactly that. Not by inventing new technology nobody else had, but by taking technology that already existed in the premium tier and manufacturing it at a scale and cost structure the premium brands couldn't match without cannibalizing their own margins. That's precisely the bet sitting underneath this SUV. Not, this is a better vehicle than a G-Class in every measurable way. Because it isn't, but this delivers the specific things about a G-Class that most buyers actually want. The look, the tech, the light off-road capability, even the aluminum body's durability story, at a price point that makes the traditional luxury SUV's premium increasingly hard to justify on engineering grounds alone. Here's the part of that shift worth sitting with a little longer, because it's easy to hear same as smartphones and move on without feeling the weight of it. Flagship phone makers didn't lose the smartphone war because their products got worse. Apple and Samsung still make excellent phones today. They lost their monopoly on excellent because excellence stopped being scarce. The same unbundling is now happening one component at a time in the automotive industry, and this SUV is a snapshot of it mid-transition rather than the finished story. The aluminum structure, the chip, the driver assistance suite, and the price tag all arrived on the same platform within the same product generation, which almost never happens by accident. If deep dives like this into the actual engineering behind these Chinese EV exports are what you come here for, hit like and subscribe, because there's a lot more of this coming. We're already tracking how legacy luxury brands respond as more of their traditional structural and technological advantages get matched at a fraction of the price. And there's a strong chance we come back to this exact comparison once more of these platforms start showing up in European and North American markets, rather than just Asia, Africa, and South America. So here's the question for the comments. Does a luxury SUV's price premium still make sense once its structural advantages get replicated for a third of the cost? Or is badge and brand history now the only thing actually left to pay for? Pick one and tell me why down below. And if you've actually seen or ridden in one of these badge variants in person, drop that in the comments too. Because I'm curious how the in-person impression lines up with the spec sheet. I read every single one,